Why, hello everybody. It is Quentin sitting in the same old spot on the same old beach to talk about the same damn things. And in today's video, I have a really exciting announcement that sort of feels like I'm in a simulation because I'm saying it. Dakota of Earth, an amazing psychedelic YouTuber, your mate Tom, and Arcana Spiritual Center have invited me to participate in an ayahuasca ceremony taking place in Mexico in about a month. This is going to be crazy. On this journey, I'm going to have the opportunity to try sapo, which is toad venom that contains 5-MeO-DMT, peyote, and of course ayahuasca itself. My experiences with DMT are pretty minimal, so it's going to be pretty interesting to basically take DMT extended release and share with the rest of you what exactly that was like. So stay tuned for that, and thank you all so much for supporting this channel. So let's jump into the topic of today's video. In this video, what I hope to sort of reflect on and maybe walk myself through in some way is how psilocybin and LSD, particularly in high doses, has pretty much revolutionized the way that I perceive consciousness itself. And for the sake of this conversation, let's call consciousness some amount of experience. So I believe this is Thomas Nagel's proposition that if there's anything that it is like to be a bat, then the bat is conscious. So that will be our operating definition of consciousness for this discussion. One thing that really stands out to me is that my views on consciousness have changed tremendously. And I think they've changed tremendously because I am now much more open-minded than before. Before experiencing some of these, what I might call mystical or sacred states on psychedelics, I was extremely dismissive of them, and for good reason. I basically would cite some phenomena in the brain that occurred that can explain exactly why that happened. But what happens when you actually enter these subjective experiences yourself is that you realize that subjectivity is all there is. And after you realize the ways in which your own subjectivity can be transmuted into different, very strange forms that cause very strange appearances and sensations, you start to realize that it's very possible that what we're calling consciousness or experience is not defined whatsoever and is much more expansive than whatever we currently understand it as. This has really led me to panpsychism. Panpsychism being the set of beliefs that consciousness is reducible to a fundamental unit of the universe, that consciousness is not some emergent property of a complex, wet brain, but the brain is something that, when patterned in the right way, consciousness can fill the space. And I really should have given an esoteric warning for the beginning of this talk, because what I'm saying is very counter to our current scientific understanding. Our current scientific understanding is that atoms assemble themselves into molecules, and molecules assemble themselves into tissue, and eventually a brain is developed, and many layers of complexity continue to stack from these base elements. And when these base elements stack, we can get certain arrangements of them into neurons, and neurons connect in networks. And when neurons connect in a sufficient way in a network, we are supposed to believe that consciousness suddenly arrives, that consciousness simply snaps into being from this product. But it doesn't seem so clear to me that this pattern isn't something that allows an already present force to fill this space. It doesn't seem clear that consciousness is being produced by matter. It seems equally valid to me that matter could simply be vessels that, when arranged properly, can hold consciousness. And this has serious implications for how I view the world. And this is very much akin to the idea of the brain as a receptor rather than the producer of consciousness. And this is often dismissed as foolish because people point to examples like, well, if I am to kill you, or I cut your head off, or I apply anesthesia, for all intents and purposes, you are no longer conscious. And most of us would agree with that. But here's the problem. We do not have a firm grasp of how to identify a system as conscious whatsoever. Locked-in syndrome is a great example of this. There's a certain but small number of people who have experienced something called locked-in syndrome, where they lose all motor function in their body. They lose absolutely every ability to communicate with the outside world. For all intents and purposes, they are dead. And yet, many people have come out of this experience claiming to be conscious the entire time. Doctors have acted in a way as if this person had no experience whatsoever, completely based on their assumptions based on what they were seeing. What do we make of this? What do we make of the fact that there are several examples that violate our intuition that consciousness can be directly observed beyond assumption? What we make of it is that we need to expand what consciousness might be. I really like to extend this to plants in particular because many people are very dismissive of the concept that a plant could have any inner experience whatsoever. My thoughts on whether plants have consciousness are basically as follows. Until neuroscientists can show us where in the brain consciousness exactly lives, or what exactly determines something as conscious, I feel completely uncomfortable calling systems with similar information exchanging networks unconscious. It is very easy to ridicule the idea that you are going to talk to a tree or talk to a plant of any regard, but listen, that tree has roots, and those roots are rather similar to dendrites, and they reach into the ground and form complex networks with many other organisms, sort of like you. And those organisms share information back and forth through chemical signaling, just like you. And they respond to stimuli in their environment, just like you. The only thing that seems to be missing here is their ability to directly persuade you of this. You might think of this as somebody with locked-in syndrome, for example. You might think of them as entities that have experience and exist, and yet, because of their path in this world, do not have the means to express it. Many people often jokingly say that when you mow a lawn, plant stress hormones are released, and you can actually compare that to pain. While I'm not convinced maybe that plants experience pain, and maybe they do, I have no problem thinking that they understand what is going on and are just as helpless to react to it as we would be. If you were a patient with locked-in syndrome, you would simply be a product of what you are. You are simply what you are. You cannot break the bounds that nature has set for you. We seem at bare minimum to be a loose bundle of receptors. Those receptors being the ability to feel, the ability to see, the ability to smell, and so on. And plants absolutely have receptors. Plants are responding to many, many external things in their environment. And this does not stop at plants. Most living organisms have some form of a receptor system that informs them what is going on in their environment. And this causes them to act in the world. And we know with humans that this accumulation of senses seems to, when a brain is combined, produce a cohesive experience where all of these things are experienced in one field. But why do we not extend this to all other forms of life? It is merely an assumption that the pink wetware that is this brain is the only way to experience active experience. Imagine the arrogance of thinking that a small primate group that rose to prominence about 200,000 years ago was the first entity to truly experience. And if you, like me, find that an absurd claim, you're really only left to consider if many forms of matter create patterns that consciousness can fill. And if we know it has occurred with us in our brain, maybe we can extend it to anything that we currently consider alive. So I think you might be able to see how this has altered the very way that I view the world, to suddenly wonder whether or not everything has an experience that we call alive is not a minor point to take on. When I look at trees and I look at blades of grass, I see complex machines that regulate themselves and attempt to propagate, just like myself. And they're different. They're absolutely different. But in some way, perhaps they're the same. And I think we should all have permission to think about these types of things, even though they seem so nonsensical. And there will be people who respond to this in a way where they share several scientific papers showing that plants don't have the exact type of nervous systems, and that there's absolutely no way that anything can have a subjective experience when it doesn't have a brain or some form of a brain. But those are assumptions. those are not backed up by anything that can be truly predicted. All our ways of assessing what a conscious system is are based on us as conscious systems evaluating it. We must remember that at all moments. Maybe it will keep us from becoming too arrogant about this. And what does this mean? I mean, does this mean we should all just die so that we don't kill any living organisms? Should we just surrender to the world so that we're not true beasts and murderers? No, I don't think so. I think it sort of paints a picture of what this reality might be, that life tends to consume life. At least in our domain. Plants are photosynthetic and can do just fine taking photons and converting it into energy. But plants are also willing to outcompete other plants for better views of the sun, for more access to solar activity. What do we make of that? What do we make of the fact that if you were to watch plants in fast forward, it would basically seem like some interesting competitive behavior to maximize and share nutrients for those in need? There are networks of complex information processing that are all throughout this world and have been here for much longer than we have. We should respect that and not think that we are the first to come. We're not the first, and we're not the last to have a sense of experience. But Quentin, does this mean that rocks could be conscious? That hypothetically, absolutely any arrangement of matter could be conscious? Well, yes, it would. It would mean that. Why does this scare us? This scares us because we have correlations between what we view as conscious behavior and not. And when you see a rock, there is absolutely no response to an external environment. So it would seem to be in violation of our principle that a living organism regulates itself or responds to stimuli. And yet, if we examine it closer, what is the fundamental difference between a brain-dead person who would later reveal that they were conscious the entire time and something like a rock? What you have in both instances is a platform of activity that exists and yet is unable to express itself, or perhaps has no will to express itself. It has neither the means or the purpose. Humans are assembled in this way. We're assembled in this pattern, and it gives us our experience. And perhaps something like a mineral has its domain of experience. Well, Quentin, you have these hoity-toity ideas about consciousness and subjective experience being possible in all forms of matter. How can we test this? How is this predictable whatsoever? How is it useful in a scientific sense? And this is where things get tricky. It might not be whatsoever. If we look very clearly at science's record, it is very good at telling us about objective phenomena and suffers tremendously at telling us about subjective experience. So what might scare science here is that this might run into an issue. We might run into an issue where science is very, very good at describing exactly what matter does and how it interacts with other systems of matter, but it is not good at describing why, when a certain arrangement of matter takes place, an intersubjective experience fills it. And this may remain a mystery. This is called the hard problem of consciousness. Why do we alight with life once our brains reach a certain maturity? What else is out there that has something akin to a brain? These are the deepest questions that we can ask. What is the reason that matter does not just continue to act and interact with other particles and not have an intersubjective experience? There's no reason that it should be here. And so the only thing that I can think is that we might have to start from ground zero in the scientific field and make a new fundamental assumption. It's an interesting experience to watch yourself when you try to think through these things, because what you find yourself doing is making objections based on absurdity. It seems that we just find it silly that other things could have intersubjective experience that are not us. Why could it not be the case that we are a form of subjective matter that acts in the world in the way that we do? We walk around and we do ape-like things, and we form social groups of varying complexity, and other organisms have their variations of this. Why could it not be the case that subjective experience fills all forms of matter, and that subjective experience has different abilities to manipulate the world based on the substrate that it is in? This would clearly explain why a rock does nothing but what a rock does, but maybe there is a bare minimum experience that it is like to be a rock. We're working with what I believe, unfortunately, are probably unfalsifiable and untestable hypotheses, but their ramifications are not minor. The ramifications of these thoughts are that this entire world is saturated with consciousness. And interestingly enough, this gets us to where many people who have powerful psychedelic experiences say. Many people say that they felt as if they immersed themselves into a hive kind of consciousness, a one consciousness that we all share. Is this possible? Is it possible that consciousness is a fundamental unit to this world? This conclusion that some or all forms of matter in different arrangements is conscious, this reinforces the most powerful sense of awe in the universe that you could ever imagine. It creates a beautiful, beautiful play of consciousness taking on different forms and different dances of the same substrate. Why it does this, or where consciousness goes after the vessel that it occupies is destroyed, is going to remain an open question, but it does raise some exciting ideas about death and things of that nature. But we must be careful to not stake our bets on some death-defying claim. It's very easy to find favor in a hypothesis because it helps you beat death. So I'm always trying to regulate that in myself, but at the same time, I want to be open to this possibility that we have to rewrite the role of consciousness into our scientific theory as not something that emerges from physical law, but something that interacts with physical law, something that appears in this domain, in this realm, when certain preconditions are met, but might not be exclusive to this realm. Before I go, I must also say you must join my Discord. We have 7,000 psychonauts who are organizing together to form a more powerful union and eventually a sovereign nation. Join us in the link below. Also, before we go, I want to mention that Test Kit Plus is an amazing resource to get all kinds of drug testing kits and substance identification guides and information like that. If you click the link in the description below, I get a 15% cut, and you get to be safer when you take substances. Thank you guys so much, and now I'm going to zoom home and read the Patreon list. Alright, you freaking legends, it's time to read the Patreon list. Let's see how fast I can go. Jason Barnes, Devin Hall, Rudy Riza, Sarap Chapagain, Antti Mikko Makinen, Rainbow, Overdue, Robbie, Jonathan Shinsky, 666, Cody, Bronson Silva, Connor Nelson, Dendare Lotus, Mike Wazowski, Lee Ron, Kevin, Lynn Norton, Meteor, Steven, Jack Donahue, Ruhan, Victor Franco, Yehuda Pescher, Leo Avila, Ethan Beadle, Christian Bernardell, Justin Mumma, Nathan Milbrand, Jerry Sedaner, Turtle Toast, Nicholas Christ, Nathan Yesheron, Jackson Powers, Professor, Tatum Scott, Jake Hall, Barnacle Blitz, The Happy Hour Show, Oven Want, Kenobi, Flameproof, Hassan DeRamzi, Karenda, Toxic Player, Mohiuddin Cheikh, 3-Pounder, Miguel Navarro, Ora McLeod, Alex Miser, I'm gonna get a damn scroll, I swear to God, Lithium Bloodwind, King Ragnar, Choosy, Ashkor Draxon, Eric Sear, Jedimenos, Adam Sornat, Damian Scoos, almost there, Austin, Andrew Dowling, Pit Coop, Rakaya Benoit, Leg Edward, John Takusis, and Voyager. Thank you all so much. You are literally the backbone of this channel. Until next time.